Let me introduce our guest, who is Jonathan Gullis, a former teacher who served as the Conservative Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent, a classic Red Wall area from Stoke-on-Trent North, I should say, from 2019 to 2024. He was one of the many Conservatives who unfortunately went down with the ship at the last election. He's a former deputy chairman of the Conservatives. After a period of reflection, he decided to join Reform UK in December 2025. And on defecting, he said, "Over time, I have watched a party, the Conservatives, I once believed in lose touch with the people it was meant to serve." He cited the Conservative Party's failings on both legal and illegal migration and relentlessly pursuing a net zero agenda as key examples of why he thinks the Conservative Party has lost the trust of the British people. Jonathan, great to have you with us. How the devil are you doing, sir?
Well, I'm very good. Thank you very much, Mark. And a big thank you to you for the invitation and obviously for those who have joined us tonight. You always worry that you're going to not have that many people interested in what you want to rant about. And my wife is desperately happy that I get to rant with all of you rather than in her here for the evening. So, yeah, looking forward to a good conversation. And please do try and put as many questions in as you can. And if I can answer them even after and Mark can then circulate that if he wanted to. I will do my best to do so as well.
Brilliant, most kind. Well, we've already got way more than 100 of you on the call already. Jonathan, let's start by looking backwards a little bit at some recent political history, because it's what's exercised me, and it was really the reason I worked with others to set up PopCon, this new group. Why did the Conservative Party achieve so little of Conservative merit between 2010 and 2024? And I'm always prone to saying that if you'd taken a snapshot of Britain in 2010 and another snapshot of Britain in 2024 when the Conservatives exited office, with all the relevant data about tax and spending and what policies have been pursued, and those were the only two things you had to go on, what Britain looked like in 2010 and what Britain looked like in 2024. If that was the only data or evidence that you had to go on, you would have to reach the conclusion that we had been governed by a woke, left of centre, high tax, anti-market, pro-regulation, green-obsessed party for 14 years, wouldn't you? What is that an overly harsh analysis? And if it is overly harsh, what's your analysis? And if you think things did go wrong, that we didn't achieve anything like as much as we would have hoped, indeed many things went in the wrong direction, why was that?
So I really thought hard about this, Mark, and I think there's some variables that have to be considered in there that and maybe in some cases did hamper previous Conservative governments. So look, the David Cameron era, as I call it, 2010 to 2016, a lot of that was hampered by being in coalition. Ultimately, a deal had to be done. And I think it was in the nation's interest to make sure that we didn't have a continuation of the Blair Brown consensus, which I think has done untold damage to our country, particularly in how we're governed. And therefore, what did we see? Compromises far more than we wanted. You know, great, very sound colleagues like Jacob Rees-Mogg, I'm sure, was pinching his nose more than he would ever wanted to. But look, I think during that time, it's easy to moan and groan, but I think there was some success. I think the deficit certainly down and reduced by around, I think it was 50%. That was an extremely important agenda that needed to take place. Corporation tax was cut. Again, something that I'm sure all of us would have been pleased to see. Universal credit was introduced. I think a much better benefit system if it works as it's intended, rather than how it ended up being towards the tenure. And then, of course, Michael Gove, you won't be shocked as a former teacher. I think the expansion of academies and free schools and the knowledge-rich curriculum have done a lot of success for the Conservative Party in terms of our record and particularly those young people. And obviously, my entire teaching career was under that particular system. There is fair criticism about the impact that's been happened when it comes to skills, vocational, technical education. I've written about it for the Centre for Social Justice in my first report, if I shamelessly plug that, Rewiring Education, which will be launching soon, which has actually got all four major political parties endorsing it with the forward. So that was a big achievement in itself. But look, let's also look at what realistically happened. Under David Cameron, I think police budgets were cut by around 20% in real terms. We saw officer numbers down by 20,000 under the then Home Secretary, Theresa May. The Conservative Party literally forfeited the party of law and order. We saw the tax burden rise eventually to the highest it ever had been on record. We saw corporation tax risen again back up to 25%, which I think was a disgrace as well. We saw a continuation of a bloated civil service. We saw a continuation of an expansive state, whether that be through further regulation or indeed creation of further quangos, or indeed giving more quangos more powers. I think if you look at the Competition and Markets Authority, I think it's almost borderline communist how it seems to be run some of the time, and I think therefore we have forfeited the ability of our politicians to make decisions. And of course, one of the biggest betrayals of all, despite the relentless promise on bringing migration down to the tens of thousands, the fact that we saw in 2023 it nearly hit 1 million in a single year, I think is one of the biggest betrayals to the British people, as well as obviously to our Conservative Party members. And so I think that there was a combination, as I say, the coalition in part is one. I think Theresa May was one of the worst leaders the Conservative Party has ever had. I have nothing positive to say about Theresa May. She very much nearly broke the Conservative Party, where many of us, I think, did, and I know I did in those European elections in 2019 that none of us wanted, voted for the Brexit Party, knowing that was probably the last chance to force MPs to finally get rid of her, and was delighted to see her resign to the benches, albeit sadly she still hung around for far longer than any of us would have liked. Her putting into law this ridiculous net zero agenda that's literally deindustrializing our country. In Stoke-on-Trent, it's choking the life out of the ceramic sector. We've seen multiple factories now shutting and moving in the last 5 years to China, to India, where obviously keep labour, which is not a good thing because their labour markets over there are obviously exploitive. But then most predominantly the energy markets, because unashamedly they are willing to use their natural resources. So, and then I think Boris Johnson came in with an idea of levelling up, but let's be frank, there was no real substance underneath the headline. And ultimately, levelling up became giving out pots of money to local areas. Like in Stoke-on-Trent, where we got, around 100 million, which I'm really grateful for, but lots of little pots of money, lots of time spent on bids for things, rather than actually, if we were going to devolve, why not devolve power properly? So why not allow mayoralties, if we're going to go down that road, have the ability to just to determine corporation tax or VAT rates or business rates in those different areas? And then, of course, Rishi Sunak, who did pick up a sticky wicket, sadly, just didn't, I don't think, was willing to be radical enough in those final 2 years to really try and change the mood or the dial. And ultimately, things like the Windsor Framework has seen us annex off Northern Ireland, which is why I rebelled with 20 other colleagues, and obviously allowed the continuation of the corporation tax remaining high, despite the fact I do believe he knows that that is a deeply damaging tax on business. So, I think there's a lot to answer for, but I will say one thing. I think the candidate selection has been rather appalling for a number of years. I'm sure there'll be some of the Conservative Party who think I should never have got there. I'm sure if David Cameron was in charge of the Conservative Party, I never would. But I think the A list did bring up some great talent. I think Brandon Lewis is one of the most extremely talented ministers I had the privilege of getting to know. But I think there was much other dross. Heidi Allen, for example, that probably came through that same system as well, with the open primary systems that we had too. We obviously also saw too many MPs being focused on as being campaigners, which is great because obviously, yes, we need to campaign our local areas. I consider myself one of those, but how many of them were interested in getting into the weeds of law making and amending and understanding how things work? How many of our MPs now are basically glorified councillors using PMQs to talk about potholes or playgrounds rather than talking about significant law factors? So I think, again, there needs to be a real look at what type of MPs are being brought in to the Conservative Party. And sadly, I think too many of them either are too careerist, they're too focused on simply just wanting to climb the greasy pole, or too many of them are happy with the continuation of the Blair, Brown, Cameroon kind of what they believe is a centre ground agenda. But I think that centre ground died off a long
Yeah,
time ago.
that's really interesting. Let's pick through some of that. I mean, you particularly highlighted immigration numbers as a perennial failing. So, the Conservatives promised in manifesto after manifesto to get the numbers down. It wasn't just sort of something went awry for 6 months in one part of these 14 years. I mean, the most brazen defence I've heard of that from a Tory spinner was they said, well, we did get migration down to tens of thousands. It was just 80 tens of thousands, right? I don't think that was how the promise was taken. It reminds me of a spinner for George Bush Sr. as president when he famously said, read my lips, no new taxes, and put taxes up. And one of his defenders said, no, he kept his promise. There aren't any new taxes. It's just old taxes going up, which again was a pretty poor defense. But migration, how did the Conservatives get that so catastrophically wrong? I know there's a lot of focus on the Boris wave, and that is indeed the big peak. But it's not as if everything was going fine either side of that. It seemed to be out of control at some level, right the way throughout the Conservative Party's tenure. And I just don't understand how that happened. Who was looking at these numbers? Who was trying to do something about it? And why were they failing?
Well, I think you and I both know, Mark, and I'm sure many of the amazing people tuning in would have been saying the same thing. Too many people bought into the Treasury orthodoxy that more migration equals more money. And therefore, for chancellors, if they were trying to find ways to spend money or cut other taxes, they felt if we allow net migration to be higher, that will therefore give us more money in our pocket to be able to spend because of the way the Treasury scores it. Now, we know that the way they've scored it is just so outdated, so ridiculous. It does not take into account GDP per capita, which we know has been extremely poor in terms of results. And look, I think the other issue is, quite frankly, and I saw it firsthand, you've got the different lobbies. There would have been the university sector saying that foreign students are great because obviously there's a lot of universities you basically relying on foreign students in order to make themselves financially viable. Our NHS, which of course, we want doctors and nurses, we took the easy option of stealing doctors and nurses from other countries rather than actually investing and training our own. When it came to the construction sector, again, because I think, did make a mistake of allowing the skills and technical vocational education be devalued, and we allowed the continuation of the orthodoxy of you must go and do your GCSEs, A levels, then university. We became wholly reliant, particularly at one stage on the Eastern European market when it came to those important skills that we need. And ironically, now those jobs are some of the safest jobs you're going to have in the AI future that's facing us. It's the white collar worker that's going to, for the first time, really feel the impact of a sort of a revolution, as it were. Unlike the Industrial Revolution, where obviously blue collar workers were hit hardest initially. So I think those are factors that meant that it was easy to pull those levers because ultimately it meant that certain targets were hoped to be hit, or we could somehow cover our backs and say that we've got more doctors and nurses in the NHS than ever before, etc., without
Or more
actually
breathing room on your budget deficits and that sort of thing. More fiscal
exactly,
headroom, yeah, is invented
exactly.
basically, but nevertheless, it's what goes on the books. But Jeff Mitchell's asked an interesting question. You touched on this. Jeff asked, do you think that there are enough true Conservatives in the parliamentary part of the party? What's your estimate of that number without prejudging your response, Jonathan? I've been told, and it seems to feel about right, if you sort of go through the list of names, that whatever the size of the Conservative parliamentary party, and it's obviously fallen in size by 2/3 since the last election, from about 360 to 120, it seems to me about a third are sound Conservatives. About a third are probably in the wrong party and should be in the Liberal Democrats or the Labour Party. And about a third are sort of in the middle, don't really have an ideological steer and will sort of go with the winning side to, keep the show on the road, but are very hard to place. A third, a third, a third. Do you think that's about right? Was that your experience in the 2019 to 2024 Parliament?
Yeah, I was very disappointed. I felt that with the 2019 intake, there was a lot of people just focused on being basically careerists. They wanted to climb the ladder. They wanted to try and get the red box. They didn't want to have discussions. The amount of times that we people willing, for example, to sign amendments, it was myself, Danny Kruger, Miriam Cates, Robert Jenrick, Simon Clarke, Neil O'Brien causing mayhem with the Rwanda bill that Rishi Sunak passed at the end, because ultimately our concern was that the bill didn't go far enough, and that if we could get a flight off the ground, no matter how many people were on it, it would demonstrate that the scheme would work to obviously deport illegal migrants and win us back at least some trust, or at least raise the question about, would you want Labour to come in and cancel this scheme that's now officially underway? And I was shocked with how many colleagues were willing to sign amendments but not be willing to vote down the bill when it was obvious it wasn't going to do what it said on the tin. And then, I put down a bill on the ECHR, a 10-minute rule bill. I appreciate not, doesn't get government backing out the gate to just simply derogate from the ECHR and then obviously lead a path to eventually leaving it. And there are sitting Conservative members of Parliament who joined Sir Keir Starmer in the voting lobbies in voting that bill down. And it was though basically, as you say, that lack of trust that I have in the Conservative Parliamentary Party, or enough of them, that means that, whilst I think we'll hear plenty of rhetoric that I'm sure I will like, and by the way, I do think Kemi Badenoch is more on the right of the Conservative Party, so I do not include her when I'm referring to those who sit on the benches. But I think far too many of the people who sit behind her will say what they now need to say, as they did in 2019, to keep their seats on Brexit. But I think, and if Reform UK did not exist, if Reform UK were not polling as they currently are, which is to replace the Conservative Party, then I think that some of these things that we've been hearing, whether it be ditching the net zero agenda, ditching the electric vehicle mandate, willing to remove benefits from foreign national offenders, or indeed just deport, oh, sorry, from foreign nationals, or indeed remove foreign national offenders. Those promises would not have been made without the existence of reform, which therefore makes me think if reform had not existed or did not exist, the Conservative Party would tap aggressively back to where they were. I will say this, though. There are some people who call themselves One Nation Conservatives. I think many of them use that as a banner to, as you say, be closet Blairites or Lib Dems. But there are within that some very good ones. One I will say is Tom Tugendhat. I think economically he is actually very sound on many issues. He's been certainly, I know foreign affairs isn't sexy or cool, but he's always been on the right side of issues like China, and obviously and our enemies in Iran, etc. And so I think people like that, who I'm sure he and I would have a very passionate discussion about the ECHR over a number of years and about immigration. I think people like Tom are fine because there's always going to be an element of a broad church. But I think Robert Jenrick summed it up perfectly. The Conservative Party is a broad church with no central religion, and I see no sign of that changing. If I give you an example, Mark, there were councillors in the West Midlands, Conservative councillors in the West Midlands, who even after receiving a drubbing in those May local elections, decided to vote with the Green Party councillors to support a motion to reaffirm and there was a climate change emergency. I mean, this is lunacy. It is pandering politics at its worst. And no one who you think is going to be pleased with that is ever going to vote for you. And therefore, I led to the conclusion that the Conservative Party is still too riddled within its membership and within its councillor base of those type of people who also want to be MPs. And I actually had some of them in Staffordshire actively bad mouthing me at every opportunity to prevent me, even if I had to have done, wanting to return to those green benches. And I just felt completely demoralised about the situation.
Yeah, let me put you the basic analysis of popular conservatism, the reason this group exists, and we've gone through the kind of topography of the Parliamentary Conservative Party. It strikes me typically the grassroots of the Conservative Party, the rank and file, are much sounder than the Parliamentary Party and probably much sounder than the local councillors. But let's put that aside for one moment. Our basic analysis is that even if you'd had a much sounder cohort of Conservative MPs, we've allowed to grow up and we embedded and possibly accelerated the new Blairite constitutional settlement, which has given immense power to Quangos, independent expert bodies, who was technically responsible to Parliament, basically a law unto themselves. And we've seen elements of this under the Labour government, the Sentence and Guidance Council deciding without the blessing of the government or the Justice Secretary that we're going to change what your prison sentence is dependent on the colour of your skin or what religion you are. The Environment Agency, Natural England, you name it. There's about 400 or more of these quangos. And they seem to wield a huge amount of power. They're responsible for about a third of all government spending, quite apart from all the crazy regulations they insist on, like building a bat tunnel over HS2. Not that we should have built HS2 anyway, but if you're going to build it, don't put a bloody bat tunnel over it. Completely mad. Would have cost £500,000 for each bat live saved. I mean, it's just extraordinary. So you had all of that going on. where MPs, you've almost got a kind of Potemkin parliament, that the MPs aren't as powerful as they should be, even if they were sounder. And then we've given huge power to the judiciary. We've politicised our legal system. I keep saying, and only half jokingly, if you want to have an impact on immigration in Britain, don't become the immigration minister, become a judge. These are the people who are setting the rules by which you can either stay in Britain or be deported. That is absolutely extraordinary. So power has drifted away. The blood of Parliament has just been sort of sapped and taken out of it and given, on the one hand, to the quangos, and then on the other hand, to an increasingly politicised judiciary that acts appallingly in some cases. The Lady Chief Justice saying that it was inappropriate for Kemi Badenoch and Keir Starmer to have a debate over the dispatch box about a particular asylum case where some Palestinians had managed to get into the country on rules that were designed for Ukrainians. Now, you can take the view of what the right or wrong policy is, but the idea that the senior judge in the country should say that that shouldn't be a matter for parliamentary debate, this is crazy. And then on top of that, you've got a civil service, and look, you can't really group them all together, but by and large, in aggregate, that is of a kind of collectivist mindset that tends to be in favour of more spending and more regulation rather than in favour of free markets and deregulation. And if you bring all of that together, it seems to me it's damn near impossible, even if you had a conservative party with a big majority, to get as much done as one would like. And consequently, the next non-Labour government is going to have to reset the governmental machinery of Britain. It sounds boring, it sounds technical. I know that very few people on the doorstep will sort of say, well, I might vote for you, but what's your position on the Northcote-Trevelyan reforms of the civil service? Nobody says that, but there is a feeling out there that the system is broken, and I think the system is broken, and there's going to have to be a massive constitutional fix to re-empower Parliament to make sure that these independent quangos and judges cannot block legitimate democratic political decision-making. Do you agree, disagree? Do you think I've overstated that or nailed it?
No, I think you've hit a lot of nails in the head there, Mark. If I give you an example of a quango, for example, Sport England. So in Kidsgrove, where I reside within the parish, in fact, I'm the mayor of Kidsgrove Parish at this present moment in time. The Kidsgrove Sports Centre was closed under Labour, and we wanted to reopen it. And we got some of the town deal funding to help us reopen it. What we wanted was some funding from Sport England, bearing in mind that obviously this would have returned a swimming pool and a gym facility in an area where childhood obesity was in one of the worst. This part of the world side is one of the worst in the country for childhood obesity. And Sport England told us because we wanted to refurbish the existing leisure centre, we could get a maximum grant of 150,000. But if we were looking to find a brand new site, bearing in mind, by the way, the current site is right next to one of the largest secondary schools in the area, so obviously great footfall and in the town centre, near the town centre. If we moved it to a different location, we could have got up to £12 million. And when I went to the minister and said, but we're refurbishing something for 7 million, so we're going to spend £5 million less of taxpayers' money and refurbish an existing facility without needing to go through extensive planning legislation. And what happened? I got told by the minister, well, I can't tell Sport England what to do. So I was thinking, well, what's the point of you? And then with the judiciary, you're entirely correct. The problem is legislation is not being drafted well at all. And so the problem is that it's being easily able to be dragged through the courts. And we have now continuous judicial reviews. And Dominic Cummings has hit the nail on the head consistently when it came to looking at the pandemic and what he did. And the reason Nadeem Zahawi was so successful at rolling out the vaccines and getting it procured was because we were able to, in that time in government and emergency, suspend normal procurement rules within the civil service, ban, I think, any judicial reviews being able to take place. And therefore, guess what? The system was able to work with the private sector, very quickly produce a vaccine that was then able to roll out, which meant that the government felt confident to reopen the country. This is a good thing when it comes to how we can take on the blob in its existing ways. And so I think that, again, we do need to look at how judicial reviews are allowed to take part against government policy and how to make sure legislation is drafted appropriately. And this all comes down to the fact that politicians, and I'm as guilty as others, I don't pretend not to have been, we seek to create the new laws and give them names. And in order to be able to say, well, I introduced a bill, it's become an act of parliament. And actually, whoever comes in, and obviously I sincerely hope it will be Reform UK. And I think with Danny Kruger in there as our head of planning for government, we've got a guy who, and if you read the Tim Shipman piece in the Spectator from last week, I think Danny has shown an extraordinary amount of vision for how in those first 100 days we should be talking about almost a great repeal act of certain legislation, the Human Rights Act, to name one of them, as well as changing the civil service code in terms of how we hire. I certainly think we should have political appointees for the permanent secretaries and director generals in each government department. Because ultimately, you need to know that the most senior people in each of those departments is signed up and a member of your agenda, and then that will help you then recruit more people from the outside world in order to come in. And then, of course, we would then also be able to return, and I think Danny's right, more power back to Parliament. The fact that to enable more scrutiny is a good thing. The fact Nigel Farage is talking about potentially two PMQs a week, as there used to be, I think is a good thing as well. As he said, as long as they're going to be proper questions where we really do get into the nitty gritty of, big national policy, what needs to change. So I think what PopCon has gone on to here is entirely correct. And the system, as I say, regardless of what people think immigration is the sole thing driving the reform vote. It's not. The cost of living is obviously having a huge impact, but also the feeling that no matter how much money is thrown at the system, you don't get a major benefit. West Streeting has had what, north of £25 billion of additional funding for the NHS, and the backlog has gone down by the total of 300,000 out of 7+ million. What return on investment is that when you've asked businesses and particularly your SMEs, to give out more of their hard-earned profits in order to throw more money at a system that clearly is not working if only 25 billion gets you 300,000 fewer people on the waiting
Yeah,
list?
yeah. There's a few questions that have come up on this. I want to come in a moment to how you finally took the decision to join Reform UK and leave the Conservative Party, but got a good number of questions on the obstacles that a Reform government would face and the opposition from the blob. You've touched on some of those, but let me put these to you, Jonathan. Dave Robertson asks, can Reform realistically tackle the civil service blob and its planned obfuscation of any Reform government? I mean, I think the likelihood is virtually nothing would be brought forward by a Reform government that would be welcomed by the civil service, right? They're likely to be hostile to nearly all of it. Mike Patterson says, how do you believe we can break the power and bias of the civil service? You've touched on that on political appointments, perhaps at the top level. He says he believes what Liz Truss said about how truly difficult it is to get right of centre policies through the quagmire. Michael Bracken on the blob says he agrees with the PopCon analysis, but he says even if we have a great repeal and restoration act, will the civil service then act in accordance with future right-wing government programmes? How many judges and civil servants would we have to replace? I mean, there is quite a big personnel thing here, isn't there? Let's imagine a putative reform government. Well, you're going to have to win, let's say, 350 seats to have a working majority. You presumably have to appoint 300 or 400 people to the House of Lords because that would be tilted against you. And then you're going to need a vast number of officials, special advisors, potentially permanent secretaries if they become political appointees. Thousands of people. I mean, I would think at least 3,000 serious people would need to be engaged in this project at Westminster level, at governmental level. What are your thoughts on those queries put? I know you've touched on some of them already.
No, I think you're right, Mark. I think you're talking about at least 1 to 2,000 very competent people just to essentially keep the system as it is before you then really can get tearing into it. So it is a huge challenge for what is, an insurgent party. Let's not bear. We have 5 members of parliament. We've got around 900 councillors, I think, if memory serves me correct, and obviously a couple of mayors to go with that. But still, very green as it were in the early days of setting up. And I think Nigel's right that at the moment we've got to continue what I would say is the electoral success. We need to show that momentum is firmly behind us. We need to make sure that people see that if they want to get rid of this socialist government, that it's only reform they're able to take them on. I know that may upset those in this who are still remaining loyal and faithful to the Conservative Party. But I think that with Dave on reform policy, I think Danny Kruger did lay it out in that piece with Tim Shipman, where he said we're going to have to produce a detailed plan so that when this election takes place and if Reform are fortunate enough to form the next government, then we will be able to go to the civil service and the House of Lords and others and say we have a very clear mandate that means that you cannot obstruct, which means that anyone who does try to do that, it makes it easier for us to take firmer action with civil servants in terms of dismissing them. But as Danny's rightly said, there are lots of good civil servants within the system, particularly at the junior levels. Dominic Cummings said this, who are keen to work. They want to be in an exciting working environment, a dynamic environment. They want to be able to help generate ideas or particularly deliver the ideas given to them by their political masters, as it were, in terms of the ministers and the government and the special advisors and indeed the prime minister themselves. But what the problem is to make sure you find that talent, and that talent is normally kept at the bottom or is normally, I think, encouraged to leave because ultimately there are too many sort of generations, it feels like, of civil servants. Families pass it on one to another. And I think actually some of the positives that the Conservatives did was trying to move government departments out of Whitehall a bit, making sure that you have some elements of each department recruited in different parts of the country. So you're getting different people with different perspectives and lived experience within the civil service rather than just the chattering university classes of London, which it feels like there's too much of. And in terms of Mike with the bias, I think ultimately you just have to make sure the civil service code is very stringent and that you do, by having these political appointees, you also enable those political appointees to be hiring and firing, quite
Yeah.
frankly. And, it should be the first job is to see how we can slim down the amount of government departments that we have. And then ultimately, how many of those civil servants do we actually need? And then let's make sure the ones we keep are the ones that are the very best and the brightest. And then let's find a way of asking people with real world experience, whether that be in business, teaching, health, how could they potentially lend some of their time so they could still retain their jobs, but maybe feed in or be part of a system somehow so that there's constantly real world people, real lived experience influencing it. I think Ian Duncan Smith went into the Department for Work and Pensions and he immediately sacked the policy team because he was like, it's not your job to come up with policy, it's my job to come up with policy. Your job is to deliver the policy that I give you that's been elected on the mandate of the British peoples. Communications teams, how is it that we've got a situation where government departments have hundreds of people in their comms teams? This is just utterly absurd in this day and age. So I think, there's another great example of what could be done. And then with Michael, sorry about how would you get them to act in accordance? Well, Danny's right. You've basically got to say, this is the mandate. We won the election. We're here to, if you want to work with us, we will work with you. And if you don't, then there's the door. And I think you did see a bit of that after the 2019 general election. I do think you saw a bit of that early on in that government, from what I was told by people behind the scenes, but ultimately it didn't necessarily, obviously, then play out as well as it should have done, or it was a wasted opportunity ultimately. So I think that I think yes, reform's going to have to just be very clear and specific about what it will do, and so there can be no ability for anyone to say, "Oh, this wasn't part of your elected mandate."
Yeah.
As we see Labour getting to constantly tied in knots at this moment in time over things that they definitely, what was it? We promised not to introduce inheritance tax on farmers. We're now taxing farmers. No one said that they were going to cut winter fuel payments. Suddenly we saw that being cut. In fact, what was it? Lucy Powell said there'd be a run on the pound if
Yeah.
we reinstalled it. Lo and behold, obviously they managed to reinstall it, and there's been no run on the pound. Who would have guessed? So,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, I think this is a classic example of where you've got to be bold, you've got to be brave, you've got to be
Do you,
visionary, and this is why I think Reform UK are the only party who have those guts to do that.
do you think that and I'm grappling with this a bit and trying to work, I'm willing to help anyone who might be involved in a government that would move things in this direction. But I'm not an expert on parliamentary procedure or civil service protocols, but I'm trying to find out about them. And it seems to me, and I've had a couple of very interesting discussions with Danny Kruger about how he's going about his various tasks, and he seems to be going about them really rather well. But it seems to me, as well as having the next government, as well as having clear policy proposals that you can say, well, we've won the election, we've got a mandate for this. Look, it's on page 47 of our manifesto. You're also going to need a playbook of exactly how you sequence things. So to give you an example that Jacob Rees-Mogg shared with me, and I'm probably mangling his brilliant constitutional insight, but things on civil service bias and the civil service sort of code of conduct, I understand that is effectively an executive power of the Prime Minister. So Jacob was actually sort of intimating to me, or I inferred from him, that kind of, in terms of the sequencing, 11 o'clock on Friday morning, on the day after polling day, that guidance is issued. It is emailed out. It's ready to go. It's not a piece of legislation, but it's something you can do immediately that you return from the kissing of hands with the king at Buckingham Palace. That can literally be, if it's ready and can be fired off. There's a separate issue about how you draft all of the various bills to repeal various things in Parliament. That's crucial as well. But I worry there's perhaps a little bit too much focus on how do we draft the act to repeal the Human Rights Act or whatever, and not enough focus on these kind of steps that can be taken in an executive order type fashion, such as that civil service one struck me as gold, right? I mean, you can get a win on the board, within 5 minutes of walking into number 10 Downing Street. And the lessons I'm trying to draw are compare the relative shambles of Trump 1.0 with the relative smoothness, certainly in terms of what they're going to do when, for Trump 2.0. He walked straight into the Oval Office after being sworn in, as a stack of executive orders as high as several telephone directories. They've been worked on, they were watertight, they were well written. He starts signing them and says, right, well, this will do that, this will do this, this will do this. That sort of non-legislative use of power and what you need to do when, what you need to do on day one, or what can't be done until day 100, strikes me as being a crucial part of the playbook that Danny Kruger is presumably writing, right?
I think you're bang on the money. I know I'm stealing your on the words here and many others, but Trump 2 is exactly the playbook that should be looked at. And ultimately, as you say, what should be clear is that as soon as it should be very clear, right? Civil service code, ministerial code, things that can be done through the executive powers of the prime minister. Let's get within the first 24, 48 hours, these things issued or rescinded or whatever it is that wants to happen. And then let's tell Parliament. And I think this is what shocked a lot of the country with Labour, bearing in mind the election was in July. Labour allowed the summer holidays to happen for parliamentarians after a general election where they said we're coming in for change and things need to happen urgently. I would like to see Parliament almost sitting 5 to 7 days a week for the first month, just ramming through legislation after legislation. So repealing, as I say, things like the Human Rights Act, leaving the ECHR, removing us, or unsigning the treaty of the Refugee Convention that we were signed up to in the 1950s, as well as obviously some of the dreadful laws that Labour have passed in their time. Let's get all that work done aggressively out the gate as fast as you can. Let's find out how passionate Labour really are about this stuff. Are they willing to sit until 2, 3, 4 a.m., which is the Parliament I read about and studied and fell in love with? Because that's Parliament at its best. Let's have those big constitutional debates. Let's talk for hours on end, but then let's find where we can build consensus maybe on some things, or maybe there's someone comes up with another idea that might work better elsewhere. But let's show the people through Parliament that this is a Parliament for the people. Therefore, we'll sit unfamily friendly hours. But guess what? You don't go into Parliament. It's not a normal job. It's not designed to be a family friendly job. There is sacrifice that comes with the ability to serve the people. And at the same time, let's make sure that a reform-led government in this case, as I hope, is just using those executive powers quickly. And as you say, Danny, I think, is certainly looking at that playbook of what could be done very quickly, even if it is at times sort of setting the tone or direction and saying, I'm signing this to let you know in the coming weeks or month, this is what's going to happen. So again, the media can, probably bedwet at times over certain things, or certain elements of the media will bedwet, as well as the liberal elite. But ultimately, that's for them to, deal with. I'm more concerned and interested in actually supporting what I think is a Danny for, what is it? Danny says radical reformation, if I'm not mistaken, I think is what he said.
Yeah.
If I've butchered his words, I apologize, Danny. But I think that's exactly what it is. And I think that's why Danny Kruger is such a big win for Reform UK and such a big loss for the Conservative Party.
Let's talk a little about you and how you reach your decision. I could have looked back and dated this, and perhaps I'm breaking all sorts of confidences here, but I think I last saw you in person in the green room at GB News a little before Christmas. And Andrea Jenkins was one of the guests. And I say I'm breaking protocols here because aren't green rooms supposed to be like Las Vegas? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in the green room stays in the green room. But I can't remember your exact words, but you were definitely generous to Andrea and sort of said good luck. And, I'm not sure you went quite so far as saying that you were delighted that she beat the Conservatives, but that was almost my takeaway from it. So I did sort of wonder, right, is Jonathan thinking about moving over to Reform? What was the key moment for you? Was there a last straw that broke the camel's back? If so, what was that last straw and what were the other straws? How long were you mulling it over? Did you procrastinate about it? Because obviously it's a kind of decision you can only make once, pretty much, right? Tell us about your thought process and how you reached the conclusion you did in December.
It's probably about 12 months. Obviously, I moved on the 1st of December last year, so it's probably about 12 months of really thinking. Um, I was very clear. I know that I get relentlessly attacked by, the left and even some conservatives, which seems bizarre, to about an interview I gave in March 2024 where I said there wasn't a cat in hell's chance I'd join Reform UK. Well, people don't play the question, which was I was asked after Lee Anderson's defection, would I be following him ahead of a general election? When I said no. And I didn't because I felt that the voters elected me in Stoke-on-Trent North Kids Grow and Talk as a Conservative. They therefore had the right to sack me as a Conservative in Stoke-on-Trent North Kids Grow and Talk. And had I made the jump, it would have just been naked opportunism in order to keep my seat. And I'm not saying it would have definitely kept my seat, but I think I'd have had a lot better chance than I was going to as a Conservative. I then obviously took a role in the campaigns for the future of the Conservative Party in terms of the leadership. I backed Robert Jenrick, I backed Priti Patel, and when she dropped out, I backed Robert Jenrick. And so yes, I didn't vote for Kemi, but was more than comfortable with her taking over. I was frustrated. What I thought was a vacation of the field for a long period of time. I was deeply concerned about the fact that in that parliamentary party, I saw a lot of Conservative MPs that simply I just don't trust. I believe they might say things now, but I know what they've said in private, obviously, having been in rooms with them, as well as having seen how they tried to do things to undermine. Look, if I give you one example, Alicia Kearns, for example, was very pro, for example, allowing puberty blockers to remain for young kids. She obviously was defending this Egyptian
Yeah.
terrorist sympathizer. This is what's so appalling within the Conservative Party, and therefore a lot of trust was sadly therefore lost. And then I look back at our record. I listened to a lot of voters in the run up to those local elections, spent a lot of time out on doors. I spoke to a lot of party members. I spoke to my own family, and I come from a very politically diverse family. I've got stepdad who's Labour, mum who's Conservative, father who's Lib Dem slash Conservative, stepmother who's Green. In fact, I think it's her grandfather, maybe a great grandfather, who's an Irish nationalist
Wow.
MP elected from the Republic of Ireland. My own partner certainly doesn't share my politics. I had a lot of conversations and ultimately thought even if the Conservative Party ends up basically mirroring Reform UK in terms of policy, or at least 90%, who do I actually trust would deliver those policies? Who do I think, if they were in power, would be bold and brave enough to see them through, regardless of how much mudslinging happens from the mainstream media or from our opponents on X? And I came to the conclusion that I could only trust Reform UK. I could not look a voter in the eye and say I have full confidence that Conservative parties would see X, Y, or Z policy through. Partly because obviously some of the shadow ministers, for example, were in jobs where they could have done some of the things they now claim they want to do if they were in power. And I just think that if you really believe it now, why didn't you do it then? So this is what it came down to in the end. And you are right. It is a huge move. I've been a member of the Conservative Party, for those who don't know, since the age of 18. My entire adult life, 18 years, I've been a member of the Conservative Party. There are some very dear friends who are some of whom are members of Parliament who I knew I was risking my friendship with, and very, very sadly, some who don't want to talk to me at this moment in time. And that just generally hurts because they're very good people and I miss them dearly. I miss their ability to rant and rave and have a good laugh. There are, and so the decision was not one taken lightly. It is one I've taken once, and it will be once only. It's a huge gamble. I'm fully aware. I think Reform UK has this once in a lifetime, once in 100-year opportunity, and if we don't grasp this opportunity, then I think what I fear is politics will return back to that Blairite Cameroon centre ground that I think is just tinkering and essentially the managerial kind of politics that many voters are disenchanted with, and we'll see fewer and fewer people engage with politics overall, which I think would be a tragedy. And I also have huge respect for Nigel Farage. He has been consistent throughout decades of his political career. If it wasn't for Nigel Farage, we would not have had a referendum put in the manifesto for the Conservative Party in 2015 to leave the European Union. Nigel Farage, whilst he wasn't part of Vote Leave, of course, played a huge part in mobilising a lot of voters who don't normally vote to come out and make sure we got that referendum over the line. I was out in campaigning in Sheffield 52-48 was our result in favour of Leave. So it was good to see that we made the national picture as well there. And I just, I just have, he's tested, he's stood the test of time. He's stood the test of time, and he's never shied away from the fight. He's never shied away from, being seen as an outlier. And ironically, isn't it amazing now that what Nigel Farage has said 10, 15, 20 years ago is now mainstream. And it
Yeah.
just goes to show how far ahead he was. And I think that's very inspiring as well. And then I'm a huge admirer of, as I say, Danny Kruger, who, Miriam and I set up the New Conservatives, a bit like what you were doing with Popular Conservatives in terms of what we wanted to do. And when I saw people like that crossing over, I thought, that really needs to give me pause for thought.
Just a couple of reflections on your erstwhile party in the chat here. Jeff Townley says the Tories will not get back into power all the time that CCHQ imposes wet Tories on constituencies. The problem is, and always has been, the grey suits on the board and at Conservative campaign headquarters. John Strafford, the doubtiest campaigner for democratising the Conservative Party. If only his proposals and blueprints had actually been adopted by the Tory party, I don't think it would be in the state that it is in at the moment. John says, Jonathan, as deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, why did you not do anything to protect members' rights and reduce the gap in the views of the voluntary party and the parliamentary party? So an interesting direct challenge to you there. That would have made a big difference, wouldn't it, if we'd actually had maybe not open primaries. That seems to be open primaries seem to, you always end up with a left-wing local GP as the Conservative candidate. But had the membership been empowered, then it seems to me that the nature of the parliamentary party would be very, very different. And I am not persuaded that Kemi, although I'm very pleased that she shifted the party on ECHR and on carbon net zero, notwithstanding the concerns that you've said about would that actually be done if the Conservatives prevailed in an election. But the Conservative Party infrastructure has not been democratised or changed. So it's not obvious to me why there would be a tilt towards proper Conservatives. But respond to that challenge from John, if you would.
Yeah, I was about to say, look, it's a very fair challenge, John. All I can say is, and you'll have to take me at your word, at my word, sorry, is internally, I was always arguing that we needed members to feel more empowered. And one of the reasons I was backing Priti Patel in that leadership contest was if you saw her piece in Con Home at the time, which I think is still available online, he was talking about he was the candidate pushing full democratization of the party, which she's also long been a believer in, giving members a real voice and a real say. And I know, John, I've seen bits of your work as well. I think thank you for never giving up the fight. And I think that had the Conservative Party listened to more people like yourself, it'd be in a much better place. And there was always this weird fear I think you came across within CCHQ at times about what the membership's like, and saw quite discerning views, I think, at times as well, of even parliamentarians, which is so bizarre when actually you need the two to be working together. I think that if you're in CCHQ, number one, you should have to sign up and be a member of the Conservative Party for at least 6 months. I would be willing to go 12 months before you can join CCHQ, so we know you're actually a committed Conservative. You should have to spend at least 6 months of your initial first year of training being a campaign manager. So let's get you out trained. So, you would be out you would be out there on the doorsteps, not in London, but in other parts of the country. I think that's the type of thing that needed to happen. And then make sure that there is a program in place to support people who want to become parliamentarians, who haven't gone maybe the traditional university route, who don't have the same contacts. I didn't have any contacts. I had to earn every contact I got, from Jeremy Wright first coming to my school when I was an A-level politics student, to Nadeem Zahawi being my local member of parliament, to Brandon Lewis then being party chairman who was willing to meet with me, to then getting to know others, and then in 2017 when I ran the general election, earning my stripes at the time by sacrificing 5 weeks of my salary to live up in the northeast in Washington and Southern West, support the campaign in Bishop Auckland, where I was able to get Rishi Sunak, Guy Opperman and others to say very nice things in the feedback about the work I put into that election campaign that all enable me to get there. And now it comes a lot of sacrifice, a huge cost, both financially and personally at times as well. And there should be more ability. There should be a smoother transition for anyone who maybe worries about having to sacrifice salary or has family commitments or caring commitments. How can we support those people rather than just, as you say, the men in grey suits always coming through
Yeah.
the system? But as I say, in reform, I've found I know there's criticism at times of the Reform Party in terms of how it's structured. This is the Reform UK is being asked to set up at a pace that I cannot think in history, in terms of democratization of the party, policies, candidate selection, opposition. I think the expectation is extraordinary, isn't it? No one asked Lib Dems or Greens to produce their manifesto. No one's really even asking the Conservatives yet to produce the manifesto, but somehow Reform has to show it all here and now, even though we're potentially 3 years still away from a
Yeah, I
general
think
election.
that's probably a downside of leading in the opinion polls, right? You've got to take the rough with the smooth a bit there. If you
No,
look like you're going to form the next government, you're going to be asked more rigorous questions than if you're languishing on 10 or 12% in the polls.
but I think there's also about equality of, opportunity market in the day. And I think that the Conservative Party are the official position, and there's not the same level of scrutiny or expectation on them that there has been placed on Reform UK, albeit obviously the polls are still the polls, and voters aren't being suckered into what the Westminster chattering classes are trying to push, which is their, some people think not we should be scared of Nigel. Some people think that the Badenoch bounce has been taking place. I'm yet to see any serious evidence of that in opinion polling, or indeed actually in terms of election results. So I think there is a. I'd like to see the media be held more accountable at times as well for what they want to try and report on.
Um, on your new party, Cheryl Hennell asked, will Reform ever become a democratised party and lose its limited company status? You touched on that, Jonathan, and I've got some sympathy. It's basically, although it's doing phenomenally well, it's basically a startup, right? So it hasn't had, decades to refine its constitution. But do you think it will become a democratised party? Are you imagining that Reform candidates will be selected on a one member, one vote basis by the local party membership? Obviously, there'll need to be an approved list of candidates to make sure that you don't get, criminals and lunatics or Holocaust deniers or whatever. But do you see that happening? Or do you anticipate actually, I don't know, Nigel and Richard Tice and Danny Kruger and Zia Youssef will sit in, well, presumably if Nigel's there, a smoke-filled room and allocate. Bill Bloggs is going to fight Southend East. Terry Jones is going to fight Cardiff West, and it will just be done that way. And the membership will have to lump it. What do how do you? There's a danger, isn't it, that it could repeat some of the centralised mistakes of the Conservative Party. But I also appreciate there's a danger of just sort of giving over unalloyed power at an early stage to a grassroots structure that you haven't really got to know yet, that's still in development. Where do you see the party going on that axis?
I think it's a work in progress, and I'm comfortable with that at the end of the day because the party wants to make sure it gets things right. At the end of the day, branches are being set up. You've got chairmen, deputies, treasurers, secretaries, like you would see in most other parties, and that takes a lot of work to find people who are, keen and enthusiastic, but to understand that does come with a voluntary workload, and do people have all the time that's necessary, and how can they obviously do the role to the best of their ability. You've also then, of course, got within that fundraising activity. Then, as you say, you've got to just do the basis of how many people want to put themselves forward. Let's make sure the vetting is continuously improving. I think that you're seeing the vetting system crank up every single time, which is a good thing. I think there's going to be an even more stringent system for vetting of any prospective parliamentary candidates as well, which is only, again, a good thing as well. And look, let's see where we are and when the election's called at the end of the day. It might well be that for this next general election, that has to be dictated more from HQ in terms of which candidate stands in which place, because ultimately we don't even know how many people in each local constituency is going to potentially put themselves forward. I'm quite comfortable with that at these early stages, as I say, because I think it's important that we make sure that reform gets the right people who have got the right background, the right attitude, the right values, and more importantly, are going to have the work ethic to go out there and convince voters in what is going to be a very fraught election, a very difficult election. Multi-party politics, not seen like it in our lifetime, certainly, I think, Mark. And ultimately, is going to require a lot of time, making sacrifices both in work and with family. And so I think that you've got to, you want to make sure that people have got the stomach for that campaign. So look, as I say, we've got a party board nationally. There was elections held for members of those party boards, Gawain being one of those, who I was delighted to see. I think Darren Grimes was another, and Dan Barker up in Manchester. As I say, you've got each branch has got its own chairman, etc., and party positions within it. There's a vetting system, when it comes to local council candidates. That's for each local area to determine who will stand where in which seats. So I think you're already seeing a remarkable amount for what is a startup, still very much. 18 months to 2 years old, really, and the
Yeah.
party is already where it is.
Now, we've seen this week of just a couple. I know we're coming up against time. There's just a couple of other things that it would be remiss of me not to ask you about, Jonathan. We've seen this week Nadeem Zahawi, former Conservative bigwig, going over to Reform. I think it's fair to say, which surprised me a bit, that the reaction to that has been somewhat mixed amongst reformers. And I'd be interested to know what you think of Nadeem going over to your new party, and also what you think of the reaction to Nadeem going over to your party. And we touched on earlier in this conversation that a huge challenge for Reform, and something that it can't easily make or build itself, is going to have to rely on finding people from elsewhere, is, what's the Reform shadow cabinet look like? Name me the 28 people who are going to be sitting around the cabinet table, or the 80 junior ministers. And Farage will presumably be Prime Minister, but we're going to have Richard Tice as Foreign Secretary and Chancellor and Home Secretary and whatever else. But then I sense in Reform as well that there's quite a concern that it becomes Conservative Party 2.0. Your name's come up a lot in newspaper articles about Nadeem Zahawi of being one of those 20 or so former Conservative MPs who have now gone over to Reform at various stages. What's your view on how that balance is being struck? That on the one hand, if you're serious about forming a government outright, you would have thought you would need people who have either been in Parliament, or a good number ideally who have experienced ministerial office. And you can't magic that into existence for those who've not had that experience. But on the other hand, if the front bench of Reform looks increasingly like a whole bunch of people who were part of a largely discredited and unpopular fag end of the Conservatives in office, you rather lose your insurgent, fresh-faced, we're something different type approach. That you just look like the Conservative Party renamed, rebadged, and in a lighter shade of blue, don't you? So Nadeem specifically, but on the wider point, how do you think Reform should take to former Conservatives with governmental experience saying, actually, I want to jump ship?
So with Nadeem Zahawi, look, obviously, as I said earlier on, I've known him for a number of years and consider him a friend and a mentor for certainly my early stages of my political life. I think it's a huge capture for Reform UK. Nadeem has extensive business background, from building a company, from the ground to ending up being a multi-billion pound corporation in terms of YouGov. He's also traded and done business around the world to understand what the economies and growing markets that are emerging as well. That can only be useful information to understand, as well as contacts that he's developed over a number of years. Then there is the fact that he has the lived government experience. And as I say, the vaccines minister, with how he got past normal procurement rules and judicial reviews, shows that he understands how, in crisis, how we can make the civil service more efficient. So therefore can use that learned experience for how we can just make it better overall, as well as obviously understanding the mechanisms of government versus parliament as well. And ultimately, as party chairman, he brought in a huge amount of money, and campaigns cost money. And I'm sure there'll be people in Reform who hope he'll be able to bring some of those who used to donate to the Conservative Party instead over to Reform UK. But your challenge, obviously, about Conservative 2.0, as I do hear, yes, as you say, as an attack against Reform UK. Well, it's bizarre, isn't it? Because I see lots in the Conservative Party attack Reform for not having the experience, and therefore they can't be trusted. So when they get someone with real experience of government and the business world, it's then, oh, well, you've now just taken a failed Conservative. I mean, this is quite bizarre. Nadeem didn't lose the election. Nadeem walked away having spent 14 years in Parliament. And actually, what Nadeem had done was go and craft himself again another successful business career. There's nothing in it for him to come back into frontline politics. He's been there, he's done it, he's got the t-shirt. Plus, obviously, he's got a successful business background, world now. He's done it because, like many of us, he's absolutely appalled at the state of the country under this socialist government and wants to see an end to this Labour rule, but also has come sadly to the opinion that we look at the Conservative Party and simply can't trust it. And I don't say that with it's not an easy thing to say, but it's just the truth as I see it, that the Conservative Party promised one thing or many things and didn't deliver. In fact, in most cases, did in the end quite the opposite, whether that be increasing the tax burden, whether that be adding further regulation, whether that be increasing legal migration, or indeed, obviously, pursuing a sort of green net zero agenda that was nothing more than pandering to left wing voters at the end of the day. So, my concern is that. Yes, reform should not and is not taking every Conservative who wants to come. I can tell you from first-hand experience, there is an extensive vetting process for ex-Conservative MPs. Nigel Farage has to personally sign off on the defection as well. And David Ball and he have said there are people they've also said no to, but out of respect, they will not be obviously making those names public. And that's obviously the appropriate and right thing to do. And so therefore, but if people are committed to the values and vision of Reform UK, and if people want to see that change and they get stuck in, as I'm going to be in these upcoming local elections that I've got in my local area, and show that they're not here to jump on a bandwagon, they really believe in the cause. And you can actually evidence that with things they said when they were an MP, which I think you can quite widely with me. Then I think that there should be no fear or no shame in people thinking that the Reform UK is the only viable option for centre-right British politics going forward. So I find it a bizarre attack, but an attack I'm sure it will continue to be used. And I just think we have to, in reform, just have to ignore it and just carry on. In terms of the cabinet or a shadow cabinet, I think that's the really interesting point. You saw Kevin Byrne, I think I've said his name correctly, the founder of Checker Trade, for example, now become the head of small business or reform for small business. I think that's a really incredible kind of capture. Someone, again, with real world lived experience who's continuing to use the money he's earned to help many small businesses. And I think those are the type of people that we want to see coming forward. I don't think you have to rush it. I think you've got 18 months, 24 months to slowly build it. But I think, yes, Nigel, I'm sure, would like to start announcing here's going to be an economic spokesperson who's going to end up being the future shadow or the future chancellor of this country. But you've got to make sure that those people who are putting themselves forward are again committed to the cause and willing to see it through. Because what you don't want is someone coming on board in a year's time saying, "Oh, the media scrutiny is too much," or "I'm having to give up too much time here. I'm not really up for it," and then you're having to replace it because that will just be used to bash you over the head with. So I don't think that's desired either at
Yeah.
the end of the day either.
What views do you have? This is not intended as a gotcha question at
No,
all.
of
It's a
course.
genuine, open question on attempting to unite the right. Now, I presume that your advice to people like me, when I'm asked what wing of the Conservative Party I'm on, I always say I'm on the Conservative wing of the Conservative Party. It's pretty strange that that isn't the only wing of the Conservative Party. I get it that you'd say, look at the polls, look at the opportunity, look at the true believers, rip up your membership cards, follow suit, join us in reform. And a lot of Conservatives have done that. And I can totally understand the logic of that decision. I don't think that makes you a traitor or a betrayer. I know lots of people who have reached that conclusion, often a painful one, especially for people like you. I mean, I've only been a member of the Tory party for 2 years because when I was at the IEA, I couldn't be a member of a political party. So it's not like an all of my adult life thing for me. I will never, ever, ever give up on Southampton Football Club, even if they are relegated to Division 9. But the political parties for me are just vehicles for achieving office. But a couple of people have said, Adam Whitlock has said, for example, with the Conservatives showing small signs of recovery in the recent polls and reform support softening, I mean, I agree that you might not be persuaded that's the case. What's your view, Jonathan, of the right of centre landscape? Is there space for both parties? I mean, there was one poll today, it seems to be a bit of an outlier, showing reform on 24%, I think, and the Conservatives on 21%. That is slightly better than the Conservatives are typically performing and a good few points worse than Reform. But if you're in the broad nexus that it's Reform 30, Tories 20, that seems to me about where we've got to in the opinion polls. Doesn't some sort of rapprochement have to happen? Because what we've discussed and agreed upon as the platform for the next government, I mean, it's going to need a hell of a mandate, right? So although you could possibly navigate away and punch in the numbers and show that Reform wins a majority of 60, even if it only gets 25.5% of the vote because there's 7 major political parties, to do the sort of stuff that you and I think needs to be done to Britain is going to need emphatic public support, right? Not just a loveless landslide by accident. What's your view of how those who share our agenda, whether you're in the Conservative Party or the Reform Party, might work together, might have to work together, might need to put partisan interests aside in the national interest? Or do you think the only shot on the board is that Conservatives like me should fold our tent and join the Teal Army?
If the Adam Whitlock I know has written that question, he'll be delighted, Mark, that you've named him. He's actually, I think, a godparent to one of my children, so he'll be delighted to
Right.
buy his shout out. If that's the end between Adam Whitlock, I think I'm pretty confident it will be. I think Adam, and we sent this directly to him now because I was going to text him. I saw him in the chat earlier, I think, is talking nonsense. That Conservative polls rallying. Well, I think, look, you've seen Kemi's personal numbers go up, and I don't dispute that she's had a positive month, as it were, in term. But I think she's also got quite an easy job of getting an ability to ask 6 questions of the most unpopular prime minister
Yeah,
in
shooting
polling
fish in a
history,
barrel.
and getting to say the things to Rachel Reeves that many of us are saying either on our social media or in the privacy of our own home. So I don't think
Yeah,
that's a huge win there. I also think that, you know, as Labour continues to go further, the Conservatives look better because ultimately they've been in second place in quite a few polls. But they are still polling, at least even on YouGov's poll today, at 20%, 4 points behind where they were at the worst ever
yeah,
result in the 2024
yeah, that's true.
general election, at least within over 100 years. So, you know, talk about a mountain still to climb. I think that YouGov poll is a massive outlier. You had an MRP from More in Common literally a week or so before that showed Reform on 31%. So I think that we should take polls with a pinch of salt. Dwayne Taylor is always very good at reminding us in Reform UK, never believe a poll that makes you smile. And I think that's good advice for everyone in any political party, because especially this YouGov one, which is week in, week out, everyone can get themselves very excited and think something's happening. Let's see. May is a huge test. Nigel Farage is incorrect that 7th of May will determine the political landscape for the next 3 years and be very much the narrative and tone that is set for the next general election. And this will be hard for people in the Conservative Party to hear. But you're looking at the Conservative Party becoming basically fighting for fourth place with the Lib Dems and Greens in both Wales and in Scotland, which will therefore see them cease to be the national party that they once were, losing also short money that will fund, I'm sure, many staffers and make it harder to get any cut through. Reform UK are literally battling it out with Plaid to lead in Wales and battling out with Labour to be the official opposition in Scotland, who, let's be frank, none of us imagined that Nigel Farage, I'm sure, in 10 years ago, 5 years ago, could lead a party that could potentially be the official opposition in
Mm.
Scotland. But it goes to show just how powerful his voice, his message, and that of Reform UK is cutting through to a wider and broader electorate. And so I think that what's happened with the reform vote in the polling is actually it's stagnated, but that's could be expected. It was a meteoric rise within 6 months of 2025. And at some point, you need to consolidate that vote to make sure it's secure, it's bankable before you then make the last big push to the 35, 40% mark, which is going to require a lot of those voters who sit at home in the last general election, who are in some cases maybe more fiscally conservative, so want to know more about reform's economic policies, convincing them to come out and vote for reform. Because my view is on any deals, Mark, to answer your main question, there is no need and there should be no deal. Nigel Farage did do a deal in 2019, and I think that he would feel rightly very betrayed by the Conservative Party that followed, despite having that huge amount of MPs and mandate to do something. And I think it would be wholly inappropriate for any such deal because also voters don't like it. Voters can see they're trying to be gerrymandered, and I don't think it's in their interest. And I think essentially in Reform UK, we have to duke it out with the Conservative Party. I think we will be obviously, I think we will win and can win the next general election. That cannot happen in the Conservative Party. And after the next general election, who knows what may happen? But it will be a very different political landscape to the one we're living in now. But ahead of any general election, there should absolutely be no deals.
Okay, and let me end then by asking you to look a bit into your crystal ball for 2026, Jonathan. What are your predictions as to what might change in the political landscape? Obviously, there's huge focus on the May elections, and I mean, I think it's really on a spectrum of how amazingly good they are for reform. It's going to be somewhere between good, very good, spectacular. It's going to be somewhere on that spectrum. But do you think we're going to have a new prime minister this year, for example? Will Labour get rid of Starmer? I mean, Labour seems addicted to always clinging on to leaders long past their sell-by date. In stark contrast, the Conservative Party is addicted to regicide, right? Can't fires their leader more regularly than Premier League football teams fire their managers. But if we were to have a sequel to this conversation this time next year in early January 2027, what do you think will have changed in the political landscape?
So I am leaning more towards that Sir Keir Starmer will remain in his position as Prime Minister. And I think that for a number of reasons. Labour's mechanism is that you need at least 80 MPs to publicly sign a letter saying he needs to go. Now, it took how long for the Conservatives to privately send letters to Sir Graham Brady to finally call a confidence vote in Theresa May? So, asking an MP to stick their head above the parapet like that is quite extraordinary. Obviously, in that election, Sir Keir Starmer's on the ballot paper against a nominated other candidate. So who's going to be the sacrificial lamb? Because it certainly won't be Wes Streeting or Shabana Mahmood or any of Angela Rayner, who are obviously seriously eyeing up the job for themselves. So then you go to the other thing. Well, are you going to see loads of resignations from his government? Well, again, you know this, Mark. The trappings of government means it's quite hard for a lot of people to walk away from the red box, the ministerial car, the additional fame and glory that comes with it. And the old adage of that he or she who wields the knife never gains power. So that's also to be bore in mind there as well. And then the polling shows that regardless of who comes in, they don't have a significant poll bounce for the Labour Party. And even though Wes Streeting is a much more competent human when it comes to giving an interview, like number one, he sounds like a human, so that's an improvement. And he's got an interesting backstory. It's still the same economy that he'll inherit with the highest tax burden on record. It's still the same Labour parliamentary party that is completely divided and will actually be more factionalised after a leadership contest. So he'll be dealing with the grumbles and moans. He'll have made promises on top of that of the manifesto that he's meant to deliver on members around, I'm sure, wealth taxes, doubling down the green agenda, trans rights, etc., Gaza,
Rejoining the
etc.,
customs union.
customs union, Gaza, etc., in order to try and win over the membership. And then on top of that, you'll also have the fact that he'll then have to also deal with the same anger out there in the public of the Labour Party that has fundamentally broken promises which he himself has been part of, having been literally in the cabinet and voting for these decisions and defending them on the airwaves. As an example, albeit I would think Angela Rayner or Ed Miliband win the membership much more over Wes Streeting. So I think that Sir Keir Starmer survives. I think Kenny Badenoch will still be the leader of the Conservative Party because I think the Conservative Party will look at the results where they will see obviously more Labour councils, albeit unless the Labour councils all get have elections cancelled, which obviously a lot of them are looking to do. But there will be such a focus on Labour. I think it will give a false sense of security to the Conservative Party that they didn't do as badly as they did last year. Well, you shouldn't be comparing elections in 2026 with 2025. You should be comparing it with when those last elections took place, 2021 or 2022. How has the vote gone? How much worse has it got? Are you still in 4 in 10 Conservative voters lending their votes to Reform UK? So I think they'll tease themselves into a false sense of security, which is fine for us. I think Reform UK, we will have a strong May, but we can't be complacent. It has to be big and it has to be eye catching, and then comes the work of showing that we are a government in waiting, starting to introduce new faces and new names that will be part of a cabinet, albeit, Mark, I know you joked and said 28, I hope it'll be much smaller than that, sat around a cabinet table, and starting to lay out a plan of this is what reforming government will now look like, moving from insurgency to campaign mode to government in waiting mode. And that will be the huge amount of work that needs to take place from June onwards, which I'm sure with Zia as head of policy and Danny as head of government planning, I feel confident and assured in their hands.
Jonathan, we've massively overrun our time, and it's been absolutely fascinating to speak to you. I will just tell everybody in the chat that our next pop conversation is on Monday, the 26th of January at our usual slot of 7 p.m. That's with Toby Young, Lord Young, the head of the Free Speech Union. That will be an interesting one. If you haven't yet registered, there's a link in the chat box about how you can register, or you can register through our newsletter on Friday. So thanks to all of you for joining us. We've had well over 150 people joining us live on this Zoom chat. But my biggest thanks to you, Jonathan. At PopCon, we're determined to ensure that whatever political parties people presently find themselves in, that all lines of communication are kept open, because we basically want the same thing, a reboot and a recovery of British democracy. And I think the next election is a crucial one. Everybody always says the next election's the most vital for a general election, but this one really is. I think if the next general election goes awry, I really fear for my country. So thanks very much for joining us, Jonathan. It's been fascinating to hear from you. Although you and I presently find ourselves in different political parties, we've got pretty much exactly the same agenda. So I have no qualms at all about saying more power to your elbow, and I wish you every success in trying to bring about the change that we all need. So it's been a real pleasure. I hope you've enjoyed it too.
Loved it, and thank you, Mark, for this amazing opportunity, and thank you to everyone who's written in. I even saw in the Q&A, I think, a comment from Dean Richardson, who I think might be the current Conservative chairman of Stoke-on-Trent Conservative. So it's nice to see that, even though obviously I'm sure I disappointed him with my decision, that he still felt able to come on tonight and take part. But most importantly, I just want to say a big thank you again to everyone for tuning in, and hopefully they found this interesting. And look, I'm sure there are people who feel let down by my decision. There are people who vehemently disagree with it. Ultimately, we all have to make our own decision. But I do think that it's becoming, whether you like it or not, the next election is going to be Reform versus Labour. And so if you want to get rid of a socialist government, you vote Reform.
On that note, whether you agree with it or not, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us. We will send you all the questions that we didn't get a chance to put. So we will send you all those questions, Dean, as well. Sorry, we've had like 60, 70 questions in the chat. Couldn't get through all of them. I tried to pick a representative sample. But thanks, everybody, for joining us. It's been a fantastic conversation. Look, Jonathan, I look forward to catching up face-to-face with you before too long, possibly back in the GB News green room, where we can rekindle our acquaintance there. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Sorry we overran, much to get through. Join us again on the 26th of January at 7 p.m. with Lord Toby Young. Take care. Have a good one. Over and out.